Hey everyone. So, we've all seen cowboy movies, and we have a pretty good idea of what the Wild West was like, which is pretty amazing when you stop and think about it. As American culture grew into a global powerhouse, its founding myth became a worldwide possession. And make no mistake, the Wild West is, first and foremost, a myth. For America, the Wild West was what the Mediterranean Sea was for the ancient Greeks. It was this vast, uncharted space where heroes rushed toward their destiny. The wild and the fearless could find their fortune here, though almost all of them were eventually ambushed by a random and strange death. This is where its own epics and legends were born, and the most famous outlaws could have easily sat down to warm themselves by your campfire. But the real Wild West was nothing like the movies. The cowboys, the six-shooters, the robberies, everything we love about westerns, it was all completely different from what we're used to. And honestly, it was even crazier. So, let's saddle up and head for the frontier, a place wandered by legends like Wild Bill Hickok, Jesse James, Wyatt Earp, and Butch Cassidy. Let's unpack how things really were back then. Let's get started. How about this for an opening scene? Wanted. For the position of sheriff, a man with the hide of a rhinoceros, a bulletproof skull, and the ability to see in all directions, must be able to outrun a horse and fear nothing and no one, not in hell and not in Coolidge. A man who can shoot straight and would rather gun down 4 or 5 drunken brawlers before breakfast than sit down to the table without such morning exercise. That was an actual ad placed in a newspaper with the absolutely brilliant name, The Border Ruffian. It was posted by the residents of Coolidge City in 1886. It sounds comical, of course. But behind this over-the-top description hides the brutal truth of life on the Wild West frontier. In Texas alone, between 1869 and 1878, outlaws killed about 100 sheriffs. Is it any surprise that towns often preferred to elect former outlaws as sheriff's men, already notorious as desperate killers? The frontier, the very edge of the Wild West, where there was no law, but the law of the gun attracted the most desperate souls. But even ordinary, peaceful settlers who went there quickly turned wild, becoming a crowd of savages or even murderers. The 19th century historian Frederick Jackson Turner vividly described their harsh customs. He wrote in particular that the frontier strips the settler of his civilized clothing, houses him in the log cabin of the Indian, and forces him to adopt their customs like, taking the scalps of his enemies while letting out a native war cry. Now, Turner was certainly sharpening his point for polemical effect, but that was more or less the reality. A crucial detail: every settler was armed with several guns. In this chaos, 4 forces tried to maintain some semblance of law. First, the feds, U.S. Marshals. These were agents of the federal government. There were very few of them, and they primarily guarded courthouses and other government buildings, and tracked down the nation's most dangerous criminals. Put bluntly, their main job was to stop people from burning down the town hall and hanging the mayor. There was no time for lengthy investigations. The second force were the sheriffs. Sheriffs were elected, responsible for their own county, and they kept order through their personal authority, or fear. That's why locals were perfectly happy to elect some known bandit or killer to the position. The third force, bounty hunters. These headhunters tracked down wanted outlaws for a reward. From the community of these noble cutthroats, famous institutions like the Pinkerton Detective Agency were born, which grew into the largest private law enforcement organization in the world. And the fourth force was perhaps the most effective arm of the law on the frontier: lynch courts. Or, to put it bluntly, vigilante justice. The ordinary, peaceful citizens of the Wild West could easily and casually string criminals up from a tree if their guilt seemed obvious. The key word here is seemed. And often, this was simply a way to settle scores with competitors or old rivals. There were even professional lynchers, known as regulators. By the way, believe it or not, lynching wasn't officially declared illegal in the United States until 2022. So, what would get you hanged? The Wild West considered 4 crimes to be the most serious: cold-blooded murder, rape, horse theft, cattle rustling. Notice that 2 of the 4 involve stealing animals. Here's why. Initially, banks weren't a prime target for frontier outlaws. First, bank vaults were always well guarded. Second, the hard part wasn't robbing the bank. It was getting away with the money. Whose money was in that safe? The local townsfolk's. And the entire town, or even the whole county, would usually join the posse to hunt the robbers down. Predictably, most robbers ended their lives after their first heist, dangling from the nearest tree. Stealing livestock was much easier, safer, and sometimes even more profitable. Alter the brand, and you're no longer a criminal, you're a respectable cattleman. So, why did Wild West gangs switch to banks and trains? Because of one invention. In 1874, barbed wire was patented, and it instantly fenced off the vast open ranges. Stealing cattle became difficult, so they had to start stealing money. Furthermore, a huge crime wave erupted after the Civil War. Many Confederate veterans, hiding from the new authorities, fled west. They saw robbing the damn Yankees as revenge for their defeated South. If you haven't seen our episode on the American Civil War, go check it out. The hero of this world, for obvious reasons, was the so-called gunfighter, a lone shooter on horseback, wearing that iconic wide-brimmed hat. Westerns and dime novels created an image of these men that, of course, is far from reality. One of the biggest myths of the Western is the hero with a revolver. In reality, many gunfighters preferred the shotgun. The revolvers of the era were inaccurate, unreliable, and smokeless powder hadn't been invented yet. After just a couple of shots, cowboys would be engulfed in a thick cloud of smoke, forcing them to shoot blind. The revolver's advantage was that it could be carried relatively concealed. But no one wore it low on their hip like in the movies. This weapon was so prone to accidental discharges that injuries and deaths from them were considered a mundane occurrence. And since no one wanted to shoot off their own essentials, the revolver was worn in front, on the belt. When necessary, the shooter's left hand would quickly unsnap the holster, the right hand would draw the weapon, and then the left thumb would cock the hammer. They didn't aim carefully. They'd just fire roughly in the direction of the enemy. The incredible marksmanship of gunfighters is, of course, another myth. The weapons were imperfect, and the bullet velocity was much lower than it is today. A modern firearm is 7 to 8 times more accurate than a Wild West revolver. Furthermore, the average time it took to fire an accurate shot with a revolver back then wasn't half a second, like in the movies, but a second and a half. Many, rushing to save time, would press the trigger early and end up shooting themselves in the foot or the knee instead of their opponent. In short, a shootout in the Wild West wasn't a refined dance of great masters. It was a chaotic and often drunken mess. Hip firing is a myth, as is firing 2 revolvers at once, especially considering that after each shot, the hammer had to be manually cocked again. Shooters carried 2 guns not to fill their enemy with lead from both hands, but because their weapons frequently misfired, and the second revolver was simply a backup. The idea of gunfighters having dozens or hundreds of kills is one of the wildest myths of all. The legendary Wild Bill Hickok only killed 6 men. Bat Masterson and John Ringo each have 2 confirmed kills to their name. What made them legends wasn't the body count, but their charisma, their cold nerve, and their indifference to their own lives and the lives of others. Most conflicts were resolved bloodlessly. Whoever looked more intimidating won. The last, but most persistent myth is the duel a constant motif in Westerns. In reality, they were a rarity. Outlaws usually ended their lives at the end of a rope, while gunfighters, including sheriffs, typically got a bullet in the back of the head. To kill an enemy from behind a corner, or as a mob against one man, that was a typical victory in the Wild West. It's no surprise that the average lifespan of a gunfighter didn't exceed 35 years. And yet, the frontier did produce truly legendary stories, though not quite as they're shown in the movies. It was home to living, breathing legends. Take Jesse James, for example. Some call him the greatest outlaw in American history, a romantic Robin Hood of the Wild West. Others see a cold-blooded killer, a psychopath, and a failure taking revenge for the South's defeat in the Civil War. Jesse James was the most famous robber of the frontier. He was born in 1847 in Missouri. His father was a preacher who later became a gold prospector, but he died of pneumonia in the California goldfields without ever seeing his son. Jesse's mother, a woman with the exotic name Zerelda, remarried twice. Her third husband, a doctor by profession, owned a large estate and was wealthy. Most importantly, he loved all his children, including his stepchildren. The estate prospered, and by all rights, Jesse James should have become a well-off heir. But in 1861, the Civil War began. His 18-year-old brother, Frank, joined the Southern Army, while 14-year-old Jesse stayed at the estate. One day, Union soldiers arrived on a punitive expedition. They were destroying the property of anyone who supported the Confederates, and the doctor's estate was in their path. They hanged his stepfather for harboring Confederate soldiers, beat Jesse within an inch of his life, and burned the estate to the ground. When he recovered, Jesse went to the front to find his brother. Frank was serving in the most brutal and ruthless unit of the Southern Army, guerrillas known as Quantrill's Raiders. They were distinguished by their absolutely savage cruelty. After the war, when most Confederates were amnestied, Quantrill's Raiders were one of the few units shown no mercy. And to be fair, it's hard to blame the Northerners. Even the Southerners themselves began to disavow the self-proclaimed Colonel William Quantrill and his barbaric methods. His raiders dismembered their enemies' bodies, took scalps, and hung them from their saddles. In 1863, they burned an entire town in Kansas to the ground, hanging over 150 unarmed civilians from trees. A particular reputation for savagery belonged to the unit of Bloody Bill Anderson, which is where Jesse James and his brother ended up. Anderson never took prisoners and was famous for carrying a personal arsenal. 4 revolvers on his belt, 4 rifles on his horse, a saber, an axe, and a bundle of extra pistols, just in case. So, the James brothers, who were still teenagers at the time, were apprenticed to the harshest mentor in the entire Southern Army. With the war's end, Quantrill's Raiders were declared outlaws. Even the Confederates themselves refused to justify their crimes. Instead of an amnesty, Jesse James received a bullet to the lung and barely survived. The path to a peaceful life was closed to him. The James brothers then linked up with another set of desperate siblings, the Younger brothers. Soon, the story of a gang that America would both love and hate began. Their first major job was iconic. On February 13, 1866, they pulled off the first daytime bank robbery in American history. Their target was the Clay County Savings Association in Liberty, Missouri, a town considered a stronghold of Union sympathizers. The take, $20,000 in coin, $14,000 in banknotes, and $42,000 in bonds. The bank was driven into bankruptcy by the loss. Their revenge was complete. Jesse himself was the mastermind. He devised the plan, but didn't take part, as his lung wound hadn't yet healed. In total, the gang would go on to rob 12 banks, 5 trains, and 5 stagecoaches. The James Younger gang was different from other outlaws. They came from wealthy families, had good manners and education, and during robberies, they were pointedly polite and even cracked jokes. When they stopped at farms, gang members paid for all the food and drink and generally comported themselves as gentlemen. However, at the slightest sign of resistance, Jesse James would use lethal force. He was responsible for numerous cold-blooded murders. Another distinguishing feature was their military discipline. Their weapons and horses were always in perfect condition. But the gang's most curious trait was its active public relations campaign. They even had a kind of PR manager, a former Confederate commander and media magnate named John Newman Edwards. He took on the task of promoting the gang in the press. He wrote about them as modern-day Robin Hoods, who only robbed greedy Northerners and gave the money to poor Southerners, which, of course, was not true, but it sounded very romantic. He gave Jesse James a platform to speak openly on the pages of his newspapers. Of course, the noble outlaw insisted he was forced into robbing banks. "We're not the problem," he claimed. "Life is." And the media magnate, through his collaboration with the gang, boosted his newspaper's circulation, soon becoming the leading publisher in Missouri. But fame had a dark side. The gang attracted the attention of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, the most dangerous enemy of crime in the Wild West. Yet, catching Jesse James's smart and cautious crew proved impossible. They frequently changed names, moved around, and the Southerners who adored them would never betray their own. After another failed attempt, Allen Pinkerton, the agency's founder, ordered his men to burn down the house of Jesse James's mother. This was utterly senseless, as Jesse hadn't lived there for years. It was purely an act of desperation and malice. On the night of January 25, 1875, a small army of Pinkerton agents descended on Zerelda's farm. They threw an incendiary device through a window, which soon ignited a store of kerosene. The fire was swift and vicious. Jesse's mother lost an arm, and his 8-year-old half-brother, who had been the first to see the strange men in the yard, suffered horrific burns and died in agony. The senseless cruelty of the act shocked the nation. The Pinkertons were called child killers, monsters, and murderers of defenseless widows, which, in fact, they were. The agency's chief publicly denied any involvement, but documents that later surfaced proved he had personally organized the arson. The authorities knew the truth, but remained passive. Pinkerton had bribed the officials. From that point on, luck abandoned Jesse James. His most disastrous failure was the Northfield Massacre in Minnesota. On September 7, 1876, a gang of well-dressed outlaws rode into Northfield to rob the local bank. The job seemed easy. The town was populated by God-fearing, good-natured residents who spoke with a funny accent, mostly immigrants from Sweden. The problem started immediately. The bank cashier refused to open the vault, even after being beaten. He wouldn't give up the money belonging to his neighbors, friends, and relatives. Jesse James, encountering such courage for the first time, was flustered and lost precious time. Meanwhile, the Swedes, having figured out what was happening, gathered as a whole town. They armed themselves with revolvers and shotguns. Those without guns grabbed axes, pitchforks, and stones. Jesse James's gang was facing this kind of civilian initiative for the very first time. The gunfire from the townsfolk was so intense that the outlaws barely had time to return fire. A slaughter began. One outlaw had his leg shot off, another his arm, another had his shoulder blown open. One of the younger brothers had his jaw shot away. Amidst all this chaos, a dead man rode high on his panicking horse. Instead of a face, he had a bloody pulp, but his dead fingers still tightly gripped the reins. The gang was destroyed. Almost all of them were killed. The younger brothers survived, but were captured, each receiving a 25-year prison sentence. Bob Younger died behind bars. Jim and Cole were released in 1901. Jim, the one whose jaw had been shot away, couldn't adapt to the new world and shot himself soon after his release. Cole died in 1916. The only one who escaped without serious injury was Jesse James himself. But the Northfield disaster broke him. He became cruel and utterly indifferent to human life, recruiting a new gang of equally unprincipled scum. This new band left a trail of murdered, innocent civilians in their wake. The end for the gang came from within, from new members, Charlie Ford and his brother, Robert. They made a deal with the government and agreed to kill Jesse James. And they did it in the most cowardly way possible. On April 3, 1882, Jesse invited the Ford brothers to his home to discuss a new bank robbery. His wife was cooking lunch in the kitchen, and his children were playing outside. The moment Jesse turned his back, Robert Ford drew his revolver and shot him in the back of the head. The murderers thought they had it made. The government granted them amnesty, gave them a pile of money, and they considered themselves national heroes. There was just one problem. The nation did not appreciate their act. Instead of fame, Robert Ford, the killer of the great Jesse James, was given the universal nickname, the Dirty Little Coward. He could never shake that label. Ford tried to hide in Colorado, where he opened a saloon. People still flocked there in crowds to see the very same Dirty Little Coward. In 1892, Robert was shot and killed by an adventurer who dreamed of making a name for himself by killing Jesse James's murderer. His brother, Charlie, fearing revenge and humiliation, shot himself. Jesse James was buried on the family farm. Remarkably, several lawmen and his brother Frank attended the funeral. Out of respect for the family's grief, the marshals did not attempt to arrest Frank, even though he was a wanted man. The tombstone was inscribed with the words, Jesse W. James. James died April 3, 1882, aged 34 years, 6 months, and 28 days. Murdered by a traitor and a coward, whose name is not worthy to be mentioned here. There's an excellent film about his assassination starring Brad Pitt, with the perfectly telling title, The Assassination of Jesse James by the Coward Robert Ford. And as for the Pinkerton Agency, it still exists today, providing security for the Olympic Games, the World Cup, Formula One, and the Oscars. All right, everyone, this has been quite a story. But now, I want to shift gears and talk about something completely different. This is the second issue of our journal, Chtivo. The theme of this issue is love. We've deconstructed this feeling from a philosophical standpoint, tracing how its very definition and its role in society have transformed throughout history, from antiquity, through the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, right up to the present day. We've gathered fascinating interviews, and our columnists have written incredible pieces on how love intersects with power, how it relates to television, how romance series are made, how love stories are written, and how love has influenced marketing essentially, how we learned to sell and make money on love. And of course, the cover star of this issue is Basta. I did a major interview with him, and, according to the editors who worked on it, it's a real tearjerker, a very raw, masculine, and deeply personal conversation. It's a piece we're truly proud of. Another great interview is with Nikolai Vasilenko, the smiling man who became last year's biggest meme. I sat down with him as well. I won't spoil everything. We've opened pre-orders on Amazon. You remember what happened with the first issue, right? We had insane, off-the-chart sales for 2 weeks straight. We had to do a reprint. We think the initial print run for this second issue is solid. But honestly, the demand was unpredictable last time, and I hope it stays that way. We've put our hearts into this issue and filled it with all our love. The link is in the description below. Go ahead and pre-order your copy. Now, if Jesse James was a tragic hero, the story of another Wild West legend, Wild Bill Hickok, contained a significant dose of farce. Wild Bill Hickok was a hero of tall tales and hundreds of anecdotes, the Baron Munchausen of the Wild West. He was a skilled marksman, to be sure, but he entered history as a prime example of how gullible journalists and the public could be. And his death remains the most famous and dramatic in the memory of the frontier. The expression, "the dead man's hand," inspired by his demise, became a permanent part of Western and poker lore. James Butler Hickok, better known as Wild Bill, was born in 1837 in a small Illinois town. His father was a farmer who was involved with the Underground Railroad, helping escaped slaves from the South find freedom, and he often enlisted his son for this dangerous work. Young James loved to roam the woods alone. He hunted to put meat on the table and earned extra money by hunting wolves. Unlike most famous gunmen, Wild Bill was law-abiding in his youth, and by all accounts, a God-fearing man. During the Civil War, he served as a scout for the Union Army, fighting bravely and often behind enemy lines. He later continued his service in the cavalry, fighting in the Indian Wars. No one knows how many Confederates or Native Americans he killed during his service, clearly a significant number. But in civilian life, his tally was only 6, and in almost every case, they had attacked him first. It was pure self-defense. With one tragic exception, which we'll get to. The origin of his nickname, Wild Bill, is unknown. The most credible version is that during the war, he single-handedly stopped a lynch mob. Witnesses agreed it was a wild thing to do, and the name stuck. The legends about Wild Bill claimed that even during the war, he carried 2 massive, beautiful revolvers with ivory handles, and that he could cock the hammer as he drew, giving him a split-second advantage. But he became a national hero not because of his skill, but due to a rather comical incident. In 1865, he met with a journalist named George Ward Nichols in Springfield. Bill spun the most outrageous yarns he could think of, just to have some fun with the city slicker. The journalist took every tall tale at face value. The newspaper then published a report that claimed, among other things, that Wild Bill had killed 100 men. The entire town of Springfield laughed themselves sick over the article. Everyone in Springfield knew and respected Bill, but the idea that he'd gunned down 100 men was absurd. The journalist had even depicted the townsfolk themselves as filthy savages, whose only hobby was growing beards. The article caused a sensation. Within a couple of years, Hickok was the hero of dozens of newspaper stories and dime novels, the official Superman of the frontier. Wild Bill couldn't stop now, and kept relentlessly mocking journalists. He told one that he'd killed significantly more than 100 men, implying he'd shot dozens more in just a couple of years. Another article claimed he'd ridden his horse onto a saloon's billiard table and then jumped the animal straight through the doorway into the middle of the street. Readers didn't bat an eye. At first, Bill found it all incredibly funny, but the joke was clearly getting out of hand. Desperate young punks started seeking him out, dreaming of killing the great Wild Bill Hickok to win their own fame. Bill fell into a deep paranoia. He always sat with his back to the wall in saloons, so no one could get behind him. He laid newspapers on the floor of his room to hear the footsteps of any potential nighttime assassins. And spoiler alert, these precautions were entirely reasonable. The day he broke his own rule was his last. Many towns dreamed of having Bill as their sheriff, and he did serve in that role for a time. His reputation was such that his mere presence resolved most conflicts, undoubtedly saving many lives. Once, he dispersed an entire gang of dangerous cowboys with a single sentence. He just said, "Boys, the train out of this town goes either east or west. You can head out in one of those directions, or tomorrow morning you'll be heading north." North of town was the cemetery. A wonderful story survives that shows how Wild Bill really dealt with gunfighters. It wasn't just about marksmanship, though. That was part of it. He once had to kill a dangerous shooter who'd gotten drunk and opened fire in a saloon. Bill went to handle the situation. A witness later recalled that upon seeing the drunken cowboy with a rifle, Bill started waving his arms and yelling, "Boys, boys, don't shoot him in the back of the head. The man is drunk." The shooter turned to see who was about to shoot him in the back of the head, and Wild Bill blew his brains out with his revolver. On another occasion, he defeated 2 drunk cavalry soldiers who also dreamed of the fame that came with killing Wild Bill and attacked the sheriff. One of them pinned Hickok to the ground, pressed a revolver to his temple, but the gun misfired. While the soldiers were figuring out what to do, Bill somehow twisted free and fired 3 bullets into his attackers. The result: 1 dead and 1 colleague with a shot-off knee. Later, in 1871, Bill found himself in an even more dramatic situation. He was informed that a mob of 50 cowboys was about to tear apart the town where he was serving as sheriff. Trying to calm the drunken crowd, Bill walked to within 10 feet of the ringleader. The man fired twice at point-blank range and missed. It cost him his life. But then, something terrible happened. In the darkness, Bill saw another man with a weapon at the ready and instinctively fired at him. It was his best friend, who had come to help him. That same day, the cold-blooded Bill made no effort to hide his feelings, sobbing uncontrollably over the body of his comrade, who died in his arms. Hickok carried the body to the man's wife, paid for the funeral, and then seemed to break. He never killed another person, and completely lost his passion for heroics and bravado. Trying to leave his old life behind, Hickok went into show business. Fate brought him together with Buffalo Bill Cody, who was developing his famous Wild West show. The spectacle was wildly popular and returned Wild Bill to national fame, but he couldn't work there for long. He discovered an unexpected acting talent, but the big, stuffy cities filled him with a terrible melancholy, and the frontier kept calling him back. Out on the frontier, he found his true love and got married. His health began to fail. He developed glaucoma. It seemed like the perfect time to start a quiet life. But Bill was ultimately doomed by his own overconfidence. He wanted to earn money for a comfortable life with his wife and traveled to the town of Deadwood. There's a fantastic series of the same name about this place that gives a lot of screen time to Bill's story. It was a gold prospector's settlement, built illegally on Native American territory. The shooter turned to see who was about to shoot him in the back of the head, and Wild Bill blew his brains out with his revolver. On another occasion, he defeated 2 drunk cavalry soldiers who also dreamed of the fame that came with killing Wild Bill and attacked the sheriff. One of them pinned Hickok to the ground, pressed a revolver to his temple, but the gun misfired. While the soldiers were figuring out what to do, Bill somehow twisted free and fired 3 bullets into his attackers. The result: 1 dead and 1 colleague with a shot-off knee. Later, in 1871, Bill found himself in an even more dramatic situation. He was informed that a mob of 50 cowboys was about to tear apart the town where he was serving as sheriff. Trying to calm the drunken crowd, Bill walked to within 10 feet of the ringleader. The man fired twice at point-blank range and missed. It cost him his life. But then, something terrible happened. In the darkness, Bill saw another man with a weapon at the ready and instinctively fired at him. It was his best friend, who had come to help him. That same day, the cold-blooded Bill made no effort to hide his feelings, sobbing uncontrollably over the body of his comrade, who died in his arms. Hickok carried the body to the man's wife, paid for the funeral, and then seemed to break. He never killed another person and completely lost his passion for heroics and bravado. Trying to leave his old life behind, Hickok went into show business. Fate brought him together with Buffalo Bill Cody, who was developing his famous Wild West show. The spectacle was wildly popular and returned Wild Bill to national fame, but he couldn't work there for long. He discovered an unexpected acting talent, but the big, stuffy cities filled him with a terrible melancholy, and the frontier kept calling him back. Out on the frontier, he found his true love and got married. His health began to fail. He developed glaucoma. It seemed like the perfect time to start a quiet life. But Bill was ultimately doomed by his own overconfidence. He wanted to earn money for a comfortable life with his wife and traveled to the town of Deadwood. There's a fantastic series of the same name about this place that gives a lot of screen time to Bill's story. It was a gold prospector's settlement, built illegally on Native American territory. And so, the name that would go down in history was born. He took the profession Butch, slang for a butcher, and the surname of his mentor, becoming Butch Cassidy. At 18, Butch Cassidy stole a horse and ran away from home, falling in with a gang of horse thieves. Settling in a small town, he developed a habit that would set him apart from other Wild West outlaws. In between crimes, Butch wasn't above doing honest work. He would rob a bank and then spend some time working as a ranch hand. This was a brilliant way to cover his tracks. No one would look for a successful robber among poor, down-on-their-luck laborers. On June 24, 1889, Butch Cassidy and two companions stormed the San Miguel Valley Bank and robbed it with surprising ease. This heist revealed another of Cassidy's key traits: meticulous planning. To give you an idea, for weeks before the job, he trained his horse to stand perfectly still while he ran up and jumped into the saddle. After the robbery, the outlaws split up. Butch laid low by getting a job on a farm on the border of Utah and Colorado. There, he played the part of a desperate, penniless laborer, even though the gang had gotten away with $20,000. He even flirted with the owner's daughters and spent most of his free time reading books in the family library. In short, he had a nice vacation, while the law was searching for him in saloons and brothels. When the heat died down, Butch bought a ranch in Wyoming. His neighbors remembered him as a charming young gentleman who adored his ranch. You can imagine their surprise when Cassidy ended up behind bars. It turned out he was using his new home as a storage depot for stolen cattle. He was sentenced to 2 years, but he didn't waste his time in prison. He used it to plan his next big heist and to map out the roster for a new gang. Upon his release, Butch immediately began assembling a crew for a series of bank and train robberies. A motive soon presented itself. A couple of his friends were arrested for murder. The sheriff claimed it was murder. They insisted it was self-defense. They needed a good lawyer, which meant they needed a lot of money. In August 1896, Butch and his friends robbed the bank in Montpelier, Idaho. As usual, it was swift, precise, and very polite. If you don't count one pistol whipping, the $7,000 haul was enough to hire one of the best lawyers in the West. Instead of the gallows, Butch's friends got 5-year sentences. The gang grew, earned the nickname the Wild Bunch, and soon became the most successful outfit on the frontier. In just 5 years, Butch Cassidy pulled off 9 major robberies, 4 banks, 4 trains, and the payroll of a successful company. And so, the name that would go down in history was born. He took the profession Butch, slang for a butcher, and the surname of his mentor, becoming Butch Cassidy. At 18, Butch Cassidy stole a horse and ran away from home, falling in with a gang of horse thieves. Settling in a small town, he developed a habit that would set him apart from other Wild West outlaws. In between crimes, Butch wasn't above doing honest work. He would rob a bank and then spend some time working as a ranch hand. This was a brilliant way to cover his tracks. No one would look for a successful robber among poor, down-on-their-luck laborers. On June 24, 1889, Butch Cassidy and two companions stormed the San Miguel Valley Bank and robbed it with surprising ease. This heist revealed another of Cassidy's key traits: meticulous planning. To give you an idea, for weeks before the job, he trained his horse to stand perfectly still while he ran up and jumped into the saddle. After the robbery, the outlaws split up. Butch laid low by getting a job on a farm on the border of Utah and Colorado. There, he played the part of a desperate, penniless laborer, even though the gang had gotten away with $20,000. He even flirted with the owner's daughters and spent most of his free time reading books in the family library. In short, he had a nice vacation while the law was searching for him in saloons and brothels. When the heat died down, Butch bought a ranch in Wyoming. His neighbors remembered him as a charming young gentleman who adored his ranch. You can imagine their surprise when Cassidy ended up behind bars. It turned out he was using his new home as a storage depot for stolen cattle. He was sentenced to 2 years, but he didn't waste his time in prison. He used it to plan his next big heist and to map out the roster for a new gang. Upon his release, Butch immediately began assembling a crew for a series of bank and train robberies. A motive soon presented itself. A couple of his friends were arrested for murder. The sheriff claimed it was murder. They insisted it was self-defense. They needed a good lawyer, which meant they needed a lot of money. In August 1896, Butch and his friends robbed the bank in Montpelier, Idaho. As usual, it was swift, precise, and very polite. If you don't count one pistol whipping, the $7,000 haul was enough to hire one of the best lawyers in the West. Instead of the gallows, Butch's friends got 5-year sentences. The gang grew, earned the nickname the Wild Bunch, and soon became the most successful outfit on the frontier. In just 5 years, Butch Cassidy pulled off 9 major robberies, 4 banks, 4 trains, and the payroll of a successful company. In a final twist of irony, the ranch belonged to the very financier whose bank they had just robbed. Upon learning this, the enraged businessman yelled, "They robbed my bank, and then they stole my horses to get away from me on." At that same ranch, Butch left his white horse, asking for it to be given to that 10-year-old boy. For the rest of his life, that man would always say, "A man who keeps his word to a child cannot be a bad man." To celebrate their last job, they decided to go out in style. The Wild Bunch gathered in a Texas town. Butch and his men took the best rooms in the hotel and caroused in every bar and saloon. Then they made the mistake that became the most iconic part of their legend. Knowing they were seeing each other for the last time, Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and their crew took a group photo for posterity. You get it, right? Even before iPhones, people were getting busted by their selfies. The photo turned out incredibly stylish and daring. The photographer made copies and displayed one in the window of his studio for all to see. Of course, he had no idea he was looking at the most recognizable, most famous gang in the Wild West. A strange twist of fate led a Pinkerton agent to that very studio. Soon, copies of the photo were sent to virtually every police station in the country. They had to flee immediately. They were racing against the clock, with time measured in hours, not days. Butch Cassidy rushed to New York, where he hastily married his longtime girlfriend, a woman who was variously described as a schoolteacher, a prostitute, or a prostitute who had become a schoolteacher. Soon, Butch, Sundance, and the new bride were on a steamship to Argentina. In Patagonia, at the very edge of the world, the friends bought 1,500 acres and started a ranch. Their years of honest labor paid off. The business was thriving. And that's where the story of the Wild Bunch could have ended. But the Pinkerton Agency intervened. Upon discovering Cassidy was in South America, where he was out of their reach, they set up a sting. They convinced the Argentine government that nearly every crime committed by gringos, foreign white men, was the work of Butch and Sundance personally. They were even framed for a bank robbery that happened thousands of kilometers from their ranch. The fact that it was physically impossible for them to travel 1,000 kilometers there and 1,000 back in a single day didn't seem to bother anyone. The hunt for Butch was on again. Cassidy and the kid fled to Chile and went back to doing what they knew and loved. They returned to robbery. Here, their principle of don't kill witnesses worked against them. The governments of Chile and Argentina, eager to pin all the unsolved crimes of recent years on them, launched a massive manhunt. Finding 2 gringos among the local population was far easier than finding 2 white men in the vastness of the Wild West. And so, it all ended in 1908 in a small Bolivian village. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, exhausted from crossing a mountain pass and nearly frozen to death, sought shelter with a local indigenous family. By a cruel twist of fate, several Bolivian soldiers were billeted there. They immediately realized who the mysterious gringos were. The legendary outlaws held off their pursuers from inside the hut, but were ultimately killed. Aside from numerous lighter wounds, Butch had been shot in the temple, and Sundance had a bullet wound squarely in his forehead. Because of this, it's widely believed that the kid shot his dying friend to spare him, then turned the gun on himself to avoid capture. The film about this, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, 1969, went down in history as one of Hollywood's highest-grossing westerns. But that's still not the most famous cowboy shootout. The classic western scene where 2 gunfighters face each other, and in a split second, someone draws a revolver, deciding who lives and who dies, has a clear and famous historical prototype: the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona. In it, the legendary shootists Doc Holliday and Wyatt Earp faced down the cowboy gang in a close-range, brutal street fight. The central figure of this story, Wyatt Earp, is one of the most ambiguous characters of the frontier. He was born in 1848 in Illinois to an honest farming family, but didn't follow in his father's footsteps. By age 20, he was arrested for theft. He had stolen money collected for school repairs. The investigation revealed he was also a cattle rustler and forger. Wyatt got lucky, made bail for $500, and had to flee the state. His subsequent life was far from the noble romance of legend. He became a part owner of a brothel in Illinois, where he was known for beating both prostitutes and clients. This became a problem, as the local law enforcement were also patrons of the brothel. Another arrest, another jail term, but this time he had to escape. In short, Earp had built a reputation as a desperate and dangerous man, which, as we remember, was valued as a quality in a crime fighter. He became a deputy sheriff in a Kansas town, and, strangely enough, was an excellent one. His wild temper and readiness for violence worked both ways. He quickly cleaned the town of all its shady characters, except himself, of course. But resting on his laurels was boring for him. He moved to another Kansas town, Dodge City, where he became an assistant marshal and immediately got into a scrape involving a murder. One cowboy attacked Wyatt along with his friends, but Earp was also surrounded by his own comrades, and what comrades they were. Among them was Doc Holliday, a gunfighter known for being terminally ill with tuberculosis and therefore fearless of death, and Bat Masterson, a veteran of many skirmishes with Comanches. The attacker was killed. In 1879, Wyatt Earp ended up in the burgeoning silver mining town of Tombstone, Arizona, where he essentially formed a family mafia with his brothers. They began to take over local business and enforce their own rules. One brother ran the local saloon, another became the town marshal, and the others were his deputies. Having a lot of brothers was a very profitable advantage in the Wild West. Doc Holliday ultimately joined their crew. The Earp brothers controlled the local minds, always stuck together, and inspired a mixture of fear and respect. They ran protection rackets for local businesses, while a rival gang, with the sheriff's support, had a stranglehold on the ranchers and cowboys. A war between the two factions was inevitable. The Earps accused their rivals of various crimes and tried to arrest them. The rivals gathered their forces for an armed stand. On October 25, 1881, the conflict reached its boiling point. The sheriff and his men brought a large herd of stolen cattle into town. Accusations flew, leading to a shouting match in a saloon. It ended with mutual promises to kill each other. The chance came the very next day. On the 26th, the two groups met near the local OK Corral. The two rival gangs faced off just meters apart. Virgil Earp, as the town marshal, ordered the cowboys to raise their hands and surrender. Instead, two of them went for their guns. In the shootout that followed, 30 shots were fired in 30 seconds. 3 cowboys were killed, and 2 of the Earps were wounded. After the clash, the sheriff arrested the Earps and Doc Holliday, but a judge ruled it was self-defense and acquitted the brothers. But this was only the beginning. 2 members of the cowboy gang began hunting their enemies. Virgil Earp was ambushed, shot in the shoulder, and maimed for life. The youngest Earp brother, Morgan, was shot and killed while playing billiards, murdered by a shot through a window from the dark street outside. His killers were never found. Wyatt Earp tried to track them down, but killed the wrong man by mistake, nearly landed in prison, and was forced to flee the state. He later went to Alaska, where he made a fortune during the gold rush, then moved to California, where he apparently made a living through gambling and real estate speculation. He lived to be 80, dying of cancer in 1929. Doc Holliday met his end much earlier, in 1887, succumbing to tuberculosis. His famous last words were said to be, "Damn, this is funny," lamenting that he hadn't died in a gunfight. The shootout at the OK Corral became one of the most retold legends of the Wild West, the subject of countless films and books. You could say that every duel scene in cinema is an endless reference to that single, half-minute confrontation between the Earps and their enemies. So, how do we know all this in such detail? How did these stories become a part of mass culture? For that, we have to thank another legend of the Wild West, Buffalo Bill. His life started much like the others. His father died early, and by age 11, Bill was working for a courier company, already an expert rider. He fought in the Civil War, distinguished himself in battle, and hunted buffalo. He could have easily robbed banks, but he was lucky enough to find a different path to fame. In 1869, when he was just 23, he met a pulp novelist, a writer of so-called dime westerns. That writer made him the hero of his next novel. A play was soon written based on the novel, and they invited Buffalo Bill himself to star in it. He was a mediocre actor, but undiscriminating audiences in civilized eastern cities packed the theaters to gawk at a live-action hero. Buffalo Bill quickly realized he didn't need a theater. He needed a circus. In 1883, he found an experienced promoter and founded his own show, a unique blend of a traveling circus and a mobile ethnographic exhibition. Cowboys, Native Americans, and other characters performed riding stunts, shot at targets, told stories, showed off their exotic costumes, and reenacted famous scenes from Wild West, life-iconic shootouts, and notorious robberies. Some of the performers were professional actors. Others were the real, authentic adventurers, like Wild Bill Hickok himself, or the legendary Lakota leader, Sitting Bull. As time went on, the line between these two categories blurred completely. For the next 3 decades, the show toured non-stop, not just across America, but throughout Europe. The public was utterly enthralled. What had actually happened on the real frontier no longer interested anyone. It was these circus cowboys who became entrenched in mass culture, cementing the myth of the frontier as a national identity. Now, let's return to the American historian Frederick Jackson Turner. In 1893, he published his landmark essay, The Significance of the Frontier in American History. By that time, the Wild West had largely been tamed and settled. It's all the more ironic, then, that Turner declared the frontier to be the cornerstone of American culture and the American spirit. In the 19th century, America had largely tried to be a new Europe, imitating the British and the French. Turner declared that America had its own unique path. Let the weak Europeans fuss with their books and theories. A real cowboy didn't need books to understand life. According to Turner, the frontier, with its daily challenges, was better than any university because it spawned democratic institutions organically. This was a new, controversial idea, but it won out and became national mainstream thought by the 20th century. Buffalo Bill and Wild Bill Hickok, with their tall tales, had unintentionally laid the foundation for a national state myth. Then came Hollywood, and Americans fully embraced their identity as cowboys, roughly at the same time that real cowboys had all but vanished. And following America's lead, the entire world caught cowboy fever. Whether this is good or bad is hard to say. But now, at least, you know who to thank for those Yugoslavian westerns starring Gojko Mitic. Friends, thank you for watching.